Hi everybody, Daniel Evans here again, and what we're going to do now is go through the basics of fiscal policy and take a look at how government budgets are determined, how budgets are affected by fiscal policy, what are some typical sources of government revenues and expenditures, and how important is the deficit and the debt in a macroeconomy. So let's get started and off we go. So the first thing we want to remember is that we're in a macroeconomy, that we have our aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And if we take an example here, we're currently in equilibrium. This is our initial demand, AD, aggregate demand. And demand and supply come together here at P1 and GDP level 1. And these levels here, this level of GDP is less than full employment GDP, which is much higher. This means that we are below full employment, and that we probably have cyclical, or we do have cyclical unemployment. And our goal would be to, well, we can wait for the economy to move towards full employment GDP, or we can push the economy forward with demand. Somehow we can push demand up towards a equilibrium here where we'd be at full employment. Now we'd probably have inflation as well because we'd be driving up prices at this new equilibrium to the right, but we'd solve our unemployment issues and we'd be at full employment real GDP. Now the way we do that in macroeconomics is through two different types of policies. The first type of policy is fiscal policy. So fiscal policy looks at taxes, so to what extent the government can increase or lower the different taxes it has at the different levels of government, and to what extent it can increase or decrease expenditures, for example, on education, on military, on infrastructure, major expenditure areas for most national, even local and regional governments. In terms of monetary policy looks at to what extent we can actually modify the amount of money in an economy. And by modifying the amount of money in the economy, we can also influence a demand for goods and services. And we'll see that in a separate chapter. But for the moment, we're going to focus on fiscal policy and how fiscal policy can impact aggregate demand. But before we get to the actual policy, let's get a better understanding of what is a government budget and what are the sources of revenue that exist. So a budget, just like you and I, the government has a budget, an annual budget, and this annual budget records the flows of revenue coming in and money going out in the form of expenses. And when the revenue coming in to the government is equal to the expenses going out, we can say we have a balanced budget when annual government spending and tax revenue, are equal. This is not always the case. In fact, it's rarely the case. And in most cases, the revenue coming in is less than expenses going out. And in this case, well, we have a deficit. We have something missing. We're spending more than we're getting, so we have a budget deficit. And this is when the government spends more money than it receives in taxes in a given year. Now, we can have the exact opposite when revenue is greater than expenses, and that would be a budget surplus. And like I said, this has happened in the past, and we do have periods when the government is in a surplus period. But for the moment, most national governments, at least, are running in deficits. So what's happened with the annual deficit in France? Now, I can show you the annual deficit in the United States, and your textbook shows you that, but let's take a look at the deficit in France over the last several years. And what we see is that the deficit goes up and down. Here we have a very, very big deficit. This is a negative number here. This is negative 6% of GDP. So here we have more than 6% of GDP. This is almost negative 8%. So we have 8% of GDP is the deficit of the state in 2010. So deficits, a bigger negative number, well, for some reason the government had to maybe relaunch the economy, or we had no we did not have sufficient tax revenue. Same thing here. And usually, and this follows basically what we see in economics, is that the deficit's going to probably get bigger, or a bigger negative number, when we have to relaunch the economy. When the deficit here is relatively small, well, that means that the tax revenues are probably close to, we're almost at a balanced budget here, close to what we have to spend. And as you can see, since 1970, there's been very few times when we've actually had a surplus. If zero here means we've balanced our budget as a percentage of GDP, we can see there's just been very few periods of time when we've had a budget surplus since 1970 in the French economy. Well, revenues, the first thing we want to look at, come from various sources. And taxes, in this case we can look at the United States. Federal tax receipts represent about 20% of GDP. Okay, and these taxes take many forms, and we see all the different forms here of the different taxes. Let me give you an understanding of these different types of taxes. The first type of tax we have is an individual income tax. This is a tax based on the income of all forms received by individuals. So if you're an individual and you receive wages and salaries, if you receive interest income, if you have capital gains incomes, all of these are annual income, a flow of income into your household, which can be taxed. And that's the income tax. The second type of tax we have is the payroll tax. This is a tax based on the pay received from your employer, and they're usually used to cover Social Security, Medicare, which is kind of like healthcare, is a healthcare system in the United States. Now, a payroll tax is called a payroll tax because it's deducted from your pay. It's deducted from your salary when you earn your salary. Some of it is paid by you. Some of it is paid by the employer. There's a sharing part going on. If you're self-employed, you pay both parts. So it can be quite an expense. Now, we say it's shared by the employer and the employee, but we're smart economists, and we know that if an employer is paying part of the payroll tax, most likely the salary that they pay us is also reflecting the fact that they have to pay payroll tax. So we can imagine that we're probably having lower salaries and lower wages to help finance the employer's share of this payroll tax. It's not as easy as we think. Corporate income tax is typically taxes that corporations pay on corporate profits. In a lot of economies, this can run between 20 and 33% of corporate profits. It's not the income. Corporate income tax is not really based on the income, the revenue they make, but it's based on the profits they make. So income less expenses. The excise tax is sometimes called a sin tax in some countries, is a tax on specific goods like gasoline, tobacco, and alcohol. And in France, for example, we have specific excise taxes on energy products. We also have taxes on alcohol. We have taxes on tobacco. And these, as I said, in some cases are called sin tax because they're usually ways we push people not to consume certain items. And we won't go into the discussion about how they're imposed, but usually they're linked to items that have a tendency to have a high degree of inelasticity. And so we do see a change in the consumption, not much, but it does generate a considerable amount of revenue for the state. And lastly, we can have estate and gift taxes. And estate taxes and gift taxes are taxes that we pass on the taxes on the assets of individuals when they move from one generation to the next. So if you were to inherit money from somebody, then that would be taxed. Now, estate taxes vary from country to country. In the United States, for example, the estate tax basically is zero unless you inherit something like $2 or $3 million. That's not the case in France. In France, we have an estate tax, which I think is around 20 to 30%. And it starts at a very low, you can inherit, I think, 100,000 euros without paying estate tax, but beyond 100,000 euros, you must pay estate tax. Now, if we look at France in 2019, France brought in 281 billion euros in tax revenue, and you can see how this was divided up. The value-added tax is a tax on the sales of goods and services, and it's the final consumer that pays that tax. It's not on intermediate goods and services, but on final goods and services sold. And that represents this value-added tax, or VAT, as we say in English, or TVA in French. This VAT tax represents 56% of revenue, tax revenue, in France today. So it's a huge amount. Income taxes only represent 26%, so a much smaller share than what we see in the United States, where the income tax, for example, is a major source of income for the government. Afterwards, corporate income taxes, energy tax, so this is an excise on energy products, inheritance taxes, and capital gains tax. Now, I'm not going to get into the debate, but some people may say that the value-added tax is not a very fair tax. Income taxes tend to tax people. People who make more money will pay a higher income tax, and we'll see why in a minute. Value-added tax, if you go out to buy a loaf of bread, or if you go out to buy a product, and somebody who makes €1 million goes out to buy the same product, you're both going to pay the same value-added tax. And so the VAT tax, for some people, is not considered a very fair way to tax people because everybody pays the same amount. And it's a point of debate. Taxes have specific characteristics, and specifically income taxes. So income taxes can take many forms. We can have what's called a proportional tax, and this is it's also called a flat tax. And a flat tax basically says that we're gonna have everybody who makes income pay X% of their income in income tax, regardless of the level of income. This is the simplest income tax to administer, and many countries have tried to move towards a proportional tax. However, the tax systems are extremely complex and difficult to change. Filling out tax forms can take days, if not weeks, to get right. It's a very complex process, and so many countries are looking at establishing a proportional or flat tax to eliminate all of the administrative costs of taxes. But this is a long ongoing debate to put into place proportional or flat percentage or flat tax. We also have regressive taxes, where taxes, in fact, for high incomes will pay a smaller share of their income. But in most countries, we have what's called a progressive tax, where the tax that's collected will increase the percentage of your income. As your income grows, the percentage tax you pay will also grow. So the more money you make, the more you pay, and the higher rate you pay. And this is represented through what we call marginal tax brackets, or marginal tax rates. So here we have the marginal tax rate system that exists in France today. So we have different brackets of income, which you see over here. And here are the brackets, the total annual income for each bracket. If somebody were earning 50,000 euros per year, for example, their last 50,000 euros, the last euro earned, would fall into this tax bracket here. Okay, so let's see how tax is actually calculated with a marginal tax rate system like this. So we have 50,000 euros that somebody's earning. The first 9,964 euros are not taxed at all. So this is zero tax. Okay. The next block of money, anything earned between 9,965 to 27,519, is taxed at 14%. So that equals 17,555 euros. And what's remaining, well, the 22,481 will be taxed in this bracket here at 30%. So what does that mean in terms of revenue collected? It's pretty easy to calculate. We calculate zero. We get zero revenue from this first block. We get 2,458 euros from this second block. And we get 6,744 euros in revenue from this third block, coming to 9,202 euros in taxes paid. And so you can see the marginal rate increases as we get higher levels of income. The average tax rate, which is the amount of tax we paid divided by our income, is about 18% in this case. So what about expenditures? We've got an idea of the different types of taxes that can be levied on people. What about expenditures? So expenditures, as we can see, have grown over time, and here we have a really good example of how expenditures increased substantially. And this is obviously the World War II period of time, World War I down here, and expenditures continue to grow. We have some countries that have high levels of expenditures like that of Sweden, with high social spending in certain economies, and some economies here, for example, United States, where expenditures, for example, on certain items are a little bit lower. France is between the two, and this is often reflected in the social spending categories. In France, if you want to have an idea of where we are in the economy, in 2018 we had a deficit of about 76 billion euros, and that has risen to about 92 billion euros in 2019. So government spending trends upwards, and government spending is going to reflect obviously certain important areas and important events in an economy. It also reflects the attitude towards certain types of expenditures. Do we spend money on education? Do we spend money on healthcare? These are choices. These are choices an economy has to make. So expenditures can take many different forms. We have different types of expenditures at the federal level, the national level of a government. We can also have expenditures, obviously, at local levels, and I'll say a few words about that in a second. Typical types of expenditures for national governments are for education, for defense spending, for Social Security and social programs, and interest payments, because governments have borrowed a lot of money over the years, and we have to pay the interest on what we've borrowed. And we'll see in a minute that's becoming quite large. If we look at total federal spending in the United States, we have an amount that's been trending upwards over the last few years, very slightly. And this is as a percentage of GDP. We see that defense spending has gone down. It was quite low. There was a slight increase in the 1980s. It went down, and then we went into certain wars over this period, so it went back up. The interest here has been tracking. It went up and now has gone down a little bit over time. Social Security is rising. This is to reflect also the fact that the population is getting older with time, and healthcare is actually trending upwards for the U.S. economy. If we look at France, if we divide up our budget by basically the different ministries that exist or branches of government, one of the most important expenditures in the French economy is education. And unlike in the United States, education is also financed at the university level in the French economy, which is not the case in the United States. And so education expenses are not as big. Military is also a big item. Also in France, if we take a look at the interest payments, these are the interest payments that the government must pay. And we can see that's a substantial amount of money, about 35 billion in interest payments that have to be paid. Okay, let's move on. Local governments also have budgets, and they also play an important role in expenditures by the state. Here we can see the local government expenditures, and I've gathered this data for 2015 to give you an idea. The government in France has a national government. We also have regional, department, and city-based governments. The operating expenses, for example, of these different departments are here. They collect taxes locally. They also make investments in roads, for example. What we do find in a lot of economies is that local taxes typically will pay for local services. Taxes made locally, typically in countries like France, include property taxes, residency taxes, and even sometimes TV taxes or things like that. These are typically associated with specific parts of the country. Property taxes and residency taxes will depend upon where you live and the services that are provided locally. And by having the tax done locally and expenditures done locally, we can minimize some of the expenses and cost of managing tax collection and distribution of funds. Let's take a few minutes to talk about debt and deficit. So here you've got the amount of debt of the USA and France, and this is the percent of GDP that the debt represents over time. And we can see that the debt of the United States has exceeded 100% of annual GDP, and it's close to that for France today. We're just hovering right near 100%. So that means that the production, the value of total production produced in a given year is about equal to all the debt and what we owe. So again, remember, what is debt? Debt is not deficit. Deficit is the difference between annual income and annual expenditures. Debt is the accumulation of what we've borrowed, what we owe to pay for these deficits. So imagine the first year you're operating a business and you have a deficit. Your income is less than your expenditures, so you have to borrow that money. The same thing the next year, you borrow a little bit more, and this accumulation of money you've borrowed is what we call the debt. It's what you owe to have run all these deficits over the period of time. Now, being part of Europe, we have certain restrictions on how big our deficit can be and how big our debt can be as a percentage of GDP. And these are ways to align the economies to make fiscal and monetary policies more effective. So if we can all somehow respect these limits, it would be good. And so we've got this treaty on stability that EU member states must try to respect. The size of the deficit, about 0.5% of GDP, and size of the deficit would be here. The limits would be the budget deficit of no more than 3% of GDP, and debts above 60% of GDP should try to be avoided. So, where are we? Well, France is currently running about, and like I told you before, we're very close to 100% of our debt as a percentage of GDP. So we've easily exceeded that 60%. Now, those aren't strict limits. We've also very close to the 3% limit on the deficit. And so we see here that deficit in 2019 was a negative 3% of GDP. It's expected to be a little bit less in 2020, but based on recent events in terms of the coronavirus, we can expect that this number will be much bigger. However, European Union countries probably will not be subject to any penalties due to the existence of the coronavirus. What changes can impact the deficit? Obviously, the baby boom. We have all of our baby boomers hitting retirement age. We can expect that we're going to have a lot more healthcare expenditures, and obviously these people, retirement people, are probably paying less taxes. So we're going to probably see the deficit increase. Recessions often see high deficits. Governments will try to relaunch the economy. We'll see that in a minute, by spending money. Also during recessions, incomes are down, and so income tax is smaller. During expansionary periods, though, what do we have? We typically have higher revenues, and if people are making more money, well, then we're collecting a little bit more tax. During a wartime, well, it's pretty obvious we're going to be having an increase in government expenditures, and we can expect that deficits will rise. Health crises, well, we're going through one right now, and we can see that the deficit will probably also increase. So how do we fight inflation, recession, and unemployment with fiscal policy? This is the real hardcore aim of what we want to do. So fiscal policy is the use of government spending and taxes to influence the path of the macroeconomy over time. There are two types of policy. There's an expansionary fiscal policy, which is aimed at increasing the level of aggregate demand through increases in government spending or decreases in taxes. We also have contractionary fiscal policy, when we want to decrease the level of aggregate demand in our economy. And we'll see why that could be the case. Okay, so let's take a look at expansionary fiscal policy. If we look at AD right here, AD represents the current demand, and this is current supply, and we're at GDP level 1, which is significantly below full employment GDP, so we probably have cyclical unemployment, and we're in a recession, and we want to pull ourselves out of this recession. We want to lower the gap between GDP and full employment GDP. Well, if we can stimulate demand, if we can push demand to the right, we can lower this gap between full employment GDP and actual GDP. We'll also get inflation. We're going to increase demand, so, well, people are we're going to be paying more for goods and services. How do we do that? How do we drive aggregate demand? Well, remember that aggregate demand is composed of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So we're going to try to act directly on these different items. The first way we're going to do it is through consumption. If we can get people to consume more, then demand for goods and services will rise. The way we do that is we can reduce income taxes and we can reduce payroll taxes to increase what's called disposable income. That's the income that people make after they've paid their tax. So if disposable income increases, we can expect that consumption will probably increase. The second way we do this is through stimulating expenditures by businesses or investment. How do we do that? We can reduce the corporate income tax rate. If corporations have to pay less taxes, well, they can also spend more money on machines and whatnot. And lastly, government spending. This is a direct impact on the goods and services. As we saw, governments are buying goods and services all the time. And so if they increase their expenditures, they're going to push demand outwards. Now, what about contractionary policy? Well, it's going to be the exact opposite. Contractionary policy is useful. Here's the situation here. If we look at P1 and GDP1, we have demand over here, and demand is very high. In fact, we've gone beyond full employment GDP. So we've pushed the economy really high. As we push the economy high along this short-run aggregate supply curve, prices will go up really high. We've got probably high rates of inflation. We're pushing the economy very, very hard. People are probably working overtime. And this is not necessarily a good position to be in. So we may want to reduce, maybe not all the way down to GDP2, but reduce back to full employment GDP. We're pushing the economy quite fast and we have high rates of inflation. We want to slow things down. And so we'll undertake what's called a contractionary policy, and we'll try to pull aggregate demand to the left towards this full employment level. How do we do it? It's the exact opposite of what we saw before. We can increase income taxes or payroll taxes and decrease disposable income for households. As people have less money to spend, they buy less goods and services. We can increase corporate income taxes for businesses, and so they spend less money on machines and whatnot. And obviously, governments can decrease expenditures of their own goods and services. So that would be a contractionary fiscal policy. Now, you're probably wondering what happened to net exports. It's the last component of GDP, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. We'll see that in a minute. Fiscal policy is divided into two large groups. And the first group we just saw is what's called discretionary policy. It's something we decide at our discretion. We do it, we don't do it. Discretionary policy is when the government decides to pass a new law or change the tax code or spend more money. These are discretionary expenditures. A very good recent example is the United States spending $2 trillion to stimulate the U.S. economy during the coronavirus outbreak. This was at their discretion. We also have what's called automatic stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers are things that kick in automatically when the economy is, for example, in a recession. So, for example, unemployment insurance is a typical automatic stabilizer. As unemployment rises, more people will receive unemployment insurance, which helps push the economy forward. Same is true with proportional and progressive taxes. These are automatic stabilizers. If people are making too much money and spending too much, we can expect that they're going to pay more taxes, and this will lower consumption, and vice versa. If incomes go down, people pay less taxes, allowing them to have a little bit more disposable income to drive consumption. So we have two types of fiscal policy: discretionary and automatic fiscal policy. Now, there are some problems with fiscal policy, and I'm going to mention one of them to you right now. Fiscal policy obviously is based on using money. If the government wants to expand the economy, for example, it has to spend money. And if we want to decrease taxes to stimulate the economy, well, if the government decreases taxes, they still have to pay their suppliers. The government still has to operate. So if we increase the deficit, we have to finance the deficit somehow. So let's take the example here. We have a government, and they're operating, and we have a bank here that has a whole bunch of money that can be borrowed. And we have businesses and households that also borrow money. Businesses borrow money to invest. Households borrow money to buy goods and services. If the government pursues a expansionary fiscal policy, they'll need money to finance their expenditures. And so they'll turn to banks. They'll go to the banking system and say, we need some money. And they will borrow that money, okay? And in exchange, so the banks give this money to the government, and in exchange, the government gives the bank what's called a bond. Okay, so they've sold a bond to the bank. This is kind of like a promise for the money, and at some point the bank will sell back to the government this bond, saying, hey, we want our money back. Now, the bad thing about this is that as the money flows from the bank to the government, there's less money for households and businesses. Okay, and this is a significant problem. Less money to borrow here because it's been given to the government usually results in higher interest rates. Okay, and the result of that is, at the end of the day, a less impactful fiscal policy. So imagine you borrow money, you can spend more money, but at the same time, because there's little bits of money left, interest rates go up, and businesses and households now have to pay higher rates of interest to consume or invest. And if interest rates go up, that could actually decrease their levels of investment. Now, this is called crowding out. This is a very unique term we use in economics. Basically, we've crowded out the investment by households and crowded out the consumption by households in this case. How do you solve it? We solve it through coordinated monetary and fiscal policy. Let's take a look at how we coordinate fiscal and monetary policy. So in this example, I'm gonna look at two different things going on. I'm gonna look at I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger to make this easier to see. So we're gonna take aggregate demand, and we're gonna take aggregate supply, which is here. We'll make this simple. And we have GDP, and we have our general price level here. And currently we're operating at this level of prices and this level of GDP. And we have prices. Okay. And what the government's going to do is it's going to say, well, we're going to push aggregate demand to the right. So let me get another color here. So we're going to push our aggregate demand to the right through increased government expenditures. So we're going to increase government expenditures, and we're going to push aggregate demand to the right. This is going to maybe pull us out of a recession. It's going to result in a higher level of GDP, which is great. we're producing more goods and services, but we also know that this is going to result in a higher level of prices as well. Now, this increase in government spending that drove an increase in aggregate demand, so aggregate demand's moved out, is in need of financing. The government spending money probably it doesn't have, may not be the case, but it could be the case. Where are they going to get it? Well, they're going to go to the banks. Well, let's go to the loanable funds market. So banks supply loanable funds. This is the supply of loanable funds, and we have demand of loanable funds. This is the money that's borrowed, and it's borrowed at a given interest rate, which is the price of money. Interest rate. So what happens? The government says we want to spend more money. We're over here on the left side. Well, to do that, we have to borrow money. So the demand of loanable funds, the demand of money in the banking system, goes up. I didn't choose a very good color here, so let me try this again. Let's try that again. So the demand of money to borrow goes up. Okay, this is because the government increased their demand of money, and as a result, the interest rate rises. Interest rate goes up. Now, as the interest rate goes up, the other components here of aggregate demand, namely consumption plus investment, well, as interest rates rise, this is going to decrease. And we know that as interest rates rise, households will borrow less. We have a decrease in investment, and so we could expect that in fact aggregate demand moves back down. So how do we combat that? How do we coordinate things so everything's looking good? Well, what we can do is we can actually play with the supply of loanable funds. So the government can issue more money, can put more money in the hands of banks. So we can have what's called an expansionary monetary policy. So we can actually increase the amount of money in the economy here. So for example, we could be out here. The supply of money goes up, and rates can come back down, and we can actually get them down to the level where they were before, eventually. So as the supply of loanable funds increases, interest rates can be held down, and we won't negatively impact consumption and investment. So to do it, as the government pushes up government spending over here, the monetary policy, which we'll talk about later on in another video, has to expand to make sure interest rates remain low. And we've hopefully solved the problem of crowding out. Let's go back to our slides. There's also an impact on trade. And we know that net exports is a key component, and fiscal policy can have an indirect effect on, obviously, exports and imports. And this, again, is a little bit complex, so let's take a few seconds to look at that. This is going to involve a little bit more complexity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at three particular markets here. Market for goods and services, we've got aggregate demand, and remember this is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So we have exports minus imports, and we have aggregate supply. Price level here, and this is GDP. We also have, and I'll draw this up on top here, we also have the market for money. We just saw this. We have loanable funds. We have interest rates. We have the supply of loanable funds and the demand of loanable funds. And we're going to have over here, let's put the demand for euros. And the supply, this is the price of euros, or the exchange rate. the price of euros. So let's do this for the European Union or France. So imagine the government wants to expand demand. We want to push the economy out, and so we will use fiscal policy to expand aggregate demand. The government will borrow money, let's say, boom, to push aggregate demand outwards. The government has now borrowed money, and so the demand for money in banks goes up. Government wants to borrow more money, and as a result, interest rates, which were down here, now find their way up to a higher level. So interest rates rise. Up they go. As interest rates rise, the foreign people, let's say Americans, whatever, find that, wow, I have money. I want to invest my money. Where will I invest my money? I will invest my money in European banks because the interest rate is much higher. So I'm going to invest my dollars in European banks. But European banks don't make deposits in dollars. They say, hey, you want to put money in our bank? Buy some euros. So what's going to happen is that the investors in the United States are going to want to buy euros to invest to make this higher rate of interest. So the demand for euros rises. And as the demand for euros goes up, so does the price. So the price of a euro for an American is very high. Well, if the price of euros is high, if the price of 1 euro, goes up. So for example, it was, let's say, $5 for 1 euro. Now I have to pay $10, let's say, for 1 euro. Well, what's going to happen to net exports? Back here. So let's go back over here. This means that my local people, my national habitants in France, can buy $10 with 1 euro versus $5 with 1 euro. And if I can get $10 for each 1 euro, well, I'm going to buy more American goods. Because if I'm French, over here, I'm going to look at the USA products, and I'm going to say, ooh, buy American, because it's cheap. And this is going to have an impact on imports, the big M here, which is back over here. So, summary, the demand is driven up by the government spending. To finance that, they have to borrow money, and interest rates rise. As interest rates rise, investors will want to invest their money in the French economy. And as that happens, they need to get more euros for their dollars because they're investing from the United States, and they're ready to pay more. The interest rate rises, the exchange rate changes as well, and as the exchange rate changes, we're going to encourage French people to buy American goods because the dollar for them is cheaper. So this initial increase in demand will actually be minimized or be taken back a little bit because of this trend towards decreasing the amount of net exports. Imports are actually going to rise. So we have a kind of a negative effect on net exports. Other problems with fiscal policy. Fiscal policy takes time to design and execute. Fiscal policy has legs. It takes us time to see that we're in a recession. That's called a recognition lag. It takes us time to create the laws and policies. This is a legislative lag. And it takes us time to put them into place. And this is particularly true, obviously, with discretionary fiscal policy, not with automatic stabilizers. Another problem with fiscal policy is exactness. Now, this is all nice in theory, and when we draw diagrams, it makes sense, but how big is the deficit, and how much more do we need to spend, and what will be the impact, and will we get it right exactly where we want it? Well, no, we won't. It's a big estimate. Also, as we put into place fiscal policy, discretionary fiscal policy, we may not see the changes in behavior that we expect. Some people sometimes behave to permanent changes. We can forecast. If I know that the tax laws change permanently, well, I can forecast what my income will be over the next few years and adjust my consumption and savings. If there's just a temporary change, I may not modify my behavior as people expect. So that's another problem with fiscal policy. Structural changes also take time. So if we have policies that want to change things in the economy, for example, the way we spend money, tax laws, whatever, all of this takes time in the economy. And lastly, politics versus economics. Don't forget that we could be in a period of great growth. And in periods of great growth, this is a great time to collect tax revenue and lower the deficit. However, if you're growing the economy, and if people are very happy and unemployment is very low, imagine a politician saying, okay, hey, look, everything's going great, let's raise taxes. And people will look at the politician and say, you're crazy. We're not going to pay higher taxes now, everything's great. But in fact, that's probably the best time to raise tax revenue. But we won't do it because the person that ever did it would never get reelected. So that's an overview of fiscal policy. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. And I'll look forward to sending you the next video then on monetary policy. Take care, everybody.